This is Howard County FY24 Spending Affordability Advisory Committee, and this is the second meeting in the new year, the fourth meeting in this round of the committee sessions there. So today's meeting, we're going to continue the discussion of HOCO by Design fiscal impact analysis. In the past sessions there, we discussed the overall process and the update of the HOCO by Design, and also Jeff, our research director of Department of Planning and Zoning, has provided very detailed analysis, fiscal impact analysis. Then we collect a lot of great feedbacks from the committee with both questions and suggested sensitivity tests for different scenarios. So Jeff is going to go over that in detail with folks there, and I'll also chime in if needed when it comes to budget-related subjects there. So hopefully we have a good discussion. At the end of discussion, I also need to set aside some time for the group to discuss whether any of the suggested sensitivity tests we should use that to replace or change the original assumption in the base model. So we'll need to spend some time, and hopefully we can make decision from the committee and say which ones we would need to change. So in other words, not only just to test an alternative scenario, but also use that to modify the original base. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff. Go ahead, Jeff. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Holly, and good morning, everybody. As Holly mentioned, this is the third meeting for the HOCO design analysis. Thank you for all your questions and feedback. Holly and I worked together to incorporate those questions and comments into the scenario analysis that I'll be showing today. And so it was very helpful. And then hopefully today we'll provide some additional information to help the understanding of the fiscal impacts of HOCO by design. So the agenda, really, we're going to go over these points here. So the first thing I'm going to discuss briefly is we decided to show the nominal results with using inflation, assuming a 2.5% inflation. And that's primarily because there was several questions on Blueprint, Maryland. And so it's important when we talk about Blueprint, which Holly's going to discuss, showing the impacts based on inflation, which is sort of the real way things work, as we know. And then after that discussion of Blueprint, we'll do a little bit of sensitivity testing. So we received questions regarding some of the assumptions and factors we used. Good questions and comments. So we've made some adjustments, and we're going to talk about that. And then sort of a summary of those sensitivity testings, and there's a total of 4 of them. And so we have the final impacts of what are the results with those changes. And then there were some other questions and clarifications we're going to go through. And then, as Holly mentioned, the very last part is a discussion of what assumption changes to include in the revised base model as we move forward. The goal eventually is to present this perhaps to the planning board and others. And so if we have the kind of a final good model that the SAC is comfortable with, then that would be the model we use as the basis moving forward. So we definitely appreciate your assistance and expertise in this process. So a quick summary, this is the results in 2023 dollars. This is real dollars. This is what I had presented back on December 13th. And as you recall, the average annual net revenues are about $52 million over the 18-year analysis period. So that basically means the revenues, all the revenues incurred by new growth associated with the HOCO by Design plan, the draft plan, less all of the costs, capital costs included, we end up with net new revenues of $52.5 million. So basically the new growth is generating more in revenues and expenditures, which has been the trend in Howard County and other counties in Maryland, as I explained before, in general. So for the HOCO by Design scenario, it's $52.5 million. The first year generates a net surplus of $30 million, and then year 18, it grows to $74.7 million. And so we wanted to include inflation to look at the nominal results. So this is the CBO's economic projections latest projections from 2022 to 2032. You can see that was the actual in 2021 was the core consumer price index was 3.6%. The projection for 2022 was 5.1. We don't have the actual for 2022 yet. And so that may change. It may actually increase a little bit. But you can see their projections, given what the Fed is doing, lowering interest rates over time. The intent is to get the inflation down to lower to 2.4%, 2.3%. This is the CBO's projection. So for the fiscal model, we assumed the long-term 18-year average annual of 2.5%, just for purposes of the fiscal, and that's pretty much in line with the CBO projections. The other thing is that the county's pension system uses a long-term rate of 2.5%, and that's from our actuarial consultant, Bolton Partners. And so it aligns also with that. So we thought 2.5% was a good rate to use. So using the 2.5%, the results end up to 71.9 million average annual revenues. Year 1 increases to 31 million, and year 18 increases to 122.6 million. So that's the inflation numbers. And then this compares the original chart without inflation on the left and the new chart with inflation on the right. So you can see the differences in all of the line items. And for the general fund, the growth is about between 32 million and 40 million per year net revenues in the first 10 years, including inflation. So that's just a point. That's what the fiscal model is showing. And then Holly, do you want to discuss this and move forward?
That. Yeah, let's stay on this page there. What Jeff said is an important in terms of the original base model was using real dollar for simplicity, basically saying if we just use FY23 base and all the future years, assuming everything adjusted 2023 dollar, what is going to mean there. So, and that's a technical model, it's very solid. But in reality, as we all know, when we actually do the annual budget, we never go back to just for a historical year's value. We use a nominal value because inflation directly impact house value, impact revenue, impact expenditures. In reality, it's really the nominal value we use to develop every year's budget on that. So by Jeff generating the nominal value version, it's actually more closely match what will likely happen. If everything perfectly happens as assumed, then the nominal value version will be really more comparable or more closely match what's a real budget that we're going to see in the future years. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. If you want to do comparison salary, the nominal value version is more realistic because that's the value we're actually using every year's budget. So that was so just to give you a general idea here. So if we use the nominal value based on CBU's projection 2.5% inflation, and in this case we assume both revenue and expenditure grows at exactly the same pace as inflation, then what's going to happen is general fund assumption is grow by 2.5% a year. So both revenue and expenditure grow by 2.5% for the base model before we adding any new development. That's what we're talking about. So so that means like at least in the next 10 years, every year's general fund budget growth is between 32 to 40 million a year. So that actually is pretty closely matched and slightly over historical average, because as you know, historically we typically a multi-years 30-some million, 30-ish million growth each year, and with inflation future years it's about that magnitude, a little bit higher on that. So that's a very reasonable assumption on that. So Jeff, if you move to next page there. So next page, we'll talk about the blueprint cost clarification, because there are some question or confusion about how does that get reflected in the model. So it's after checking all the numbers there, it's becomes very clear to us is that the Hoku by Design fiscal analysis there is actually already captured the projected blueprint cost as projected by our school system there. So we're still working with the school system to get most updated blueprint implementation costs there. And actually, I know they are very working very hard to develop superintendent proposed FY24 budget. So after that's get available, I think they might have an updated version that with updated information there for the next many years, because they typically generate a multi-year projection after that as well. But based on the number we had last year, that's the last time we had a detailed Excel sheet from them that was the blueprint cost there. And based on their own projections there, the projected implementation cost for blueprint minus projected state aid increase there for blueprint there, then in the next 10 years, the school system were saying that it's going to generate a cost increase in the 10 years, cumulatively about 165 million from the original FY22 based on that. So that was the general cost on that there. So if based on the local by design fiscal impact analysis, the nominal value use the same approach as school system, they're also using that nominal value. Then the next 10 years, if we're assuming 2.5% growth each year in terms of county funded school cost increase, then in the same time period is 189 million increase, which is higher than what's original school projections. And this morning, when we just started a meeting, I just got an email, from school staff, and they have some updated information based on FY23 approved school budget. And based on that, I took very quick look. It seems the number is 137 million, not 165, but understanding the number is still being modified in terms of school side. Anyway, it is believed that the 10-year projection, or we're having at 20 years there, it's more than sufficient to cover projected blueprint costs. So that's already factored in the base there. The other things to point it out is the state, both MSDE and also DOS have said in different occasions and in writing that blueprint implementation coupled with increased state aid is intended to help local systems there across Maryland to help refocus and reprioritize programs there. It's not intended to create newly unfunded mandates to local governments. They also said the blueprint is really emphasized a lot, such as minimum wage for the teachers to have bump up to $60,000 there by certain time. And as a result, the pay scale all change that impact other teachers there, which is already folded into our school system projection, the numbers we saw earlier on that there. And also there's a clear letter, development for teachers, special education, pre-K, all those different parts, that's already captured in. They're also saying that this is not on top of everything, but supposed to be the priority, and every school system need to reprioritize to live with that. Secondly, they also said, because Howard County have been doing very good above maintenance efforts every year, in fact, the last 10 years-ish, they're in some years significantly above MOE, like last year, right? We have a very significant growth there. So as a result, they believe if we just do our own general historical trend, which is about 14, 16 million-ish growth every year, this is not going to cost any additional on top of that. So that's the general understanding that I want to share with the group. And next slide, Jeff, I also want to talk a little bit about general methodology. Yeah. So another thing I want to help everybody understand a little bit more, and Jeff, feel free to chime in, is about the concept of this fiscal impact analysis. Really, the focus of this analysis is to understand local by design potential fiscal impact, right? So it's really focused on the new development impact on the county. So we have to have a base year, a reasonable base year, and for nominal value building inflation as proxy. The model is not intended, or it's also not, frankly speaking, not possible to project any other changes throughout the next 18 years that change the base itself on that there, because in reality there will be other elements that we really don't know. I mean, down the road, it could be state or local government, they can increase tax rate, they can add a new tax rate that bring down the revenues, or some of those the revenue could be growing faster than inflation, and then some of the costs can be growing faster than inflation, or in some years, if it's recession, everything will be lower than inflation growth on that, right? There's a lot of other policy change that could result in a shift between services within the same budget. All those things we cannot predict, and we cannot create 100 different scenarios based on that. That's really beyond the scope and not the purpose of this exercise. The other thing to keep in mind is that if people believe, or it's possible the base scenario, even after building inflation, that's not going to be the true cost. The true cost could be, say, higher than that. Then what's going to happen is, keep in mind, local government, we're not like federal government. We have to develop, balance the budget. So what's happening is that if in reality is more costs that everybody agreed to fund, then if the revenue is the same, then what's happened is you have to, assuming tax rate increase there. So as a result, the model, what's going to happen is both expenditure and revenue will be higher as a base. So the same development will generate more cost, but also more revenue to cover that there. So I don't think it's going to help too much. And also we don't understand the direction it could go either way. So I would say the model itself, the base is a very solid one. And once you're building inflation, it gives a very good indication about on annual basis and also historical trend. Another thing, but by the way, like when you look at the very long-term multi-year models there, the more important thing is the general magnitude as well as the trend. It's less about accuracy, because the longer you are into the future, the less likely you will be very accurate. But the trend is important, the magnitude is important, so you have an idea about the base. In reality, it could swing either way, but hopefully more marginally. So at least you have a pretty good understanding about the general trend and general likely results. That's the purpose of this. Thank you, Jeff. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Holly. And that's a really good lead into the scenario testing. The value of the scenario testing is looking at the magnitude of the changes. We know the base model, and then the question comes up, what if we change these various things that you see on the screen? Is it going to have a big impact? And it's really looking at the magnitude between the difference to get a comfort level of, is this fiscal model relatively accurate in terms of projecting a general trend of the impact on the budget from new growth. And so we're going to go through these four tests. These are the ones that were submitted by several members of this group. So thank you very much. And it was discussed last time also on the 13th. So the first one is increasing the mortgage rate. As we know, mortgage rates have changed in recent months. Increasing the capitalization rate, which relates to the valuation for rental properties. Increase in the home affordability ratio to 32%. And we're also going to reduce the non-residential assessed values to reflect potential impact from the remote work trend. So that would reflect both reduction in amount of office space and commercial space built. It also could reflect the reduction in the assessed value given the demand may be lower. So we're to go through each of those. So as you recall, for the first one, we had this somewhat complicated setup in the model that tries to develop a good methodology for local income tax. So since people that live in the homes need to afford the homes, their income has to reflect that. And so we start with the typical market value for a home. And we did this for all 5 planning areas for all housing types. This is one example in Elk Ridge for single family detached. We also have similar charts for townhomes, for condos, and we have a different methodology for rental apartments in the 5 planning areas. So in Elkridge, the estimated market value in recent years is $650,000 about for a new home built. Assuming a 20% down payment, you need a loan amount of $518,000. And then based on that loan amount, you calculate what the monthly payment needs to be, including mortgage payment, property taxes, HOA fee, and insurance. And then based on that monthly payment, you have an affordability ratio. We had used 28%. And let me kind of, oh, wrong one. Sorry about that. This is the mortgage rate, right? Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So we use 28%. So basically that means 28% of household income should be used for housing costs. And that translates into a gross income of about $155,000. And then from that, you generate net income after your deductions and things. And then you end up with a local income tax by multiplying the taxable income times the 3.2% tax rate. So the annual local income tax for a new homeowner in a home in Elkridge, single family detached, is estimated to pay about $3,500 per year to Howard County. So if we wanted to look at the 30-year fixed rate, it has increased. So first of all, if you look at the long-term history from 71, goes way back to 2022. This is from Freddie Mac. The average rate is 7.76. From 71 to 2002, it's high. You can see it very high in the 80s, and the average is 9.69%. And then from 2002 to 2022, so the last 2 decades, the average is quite low, relatively at 4.77%. But it has increased. So as of December this year, the 30-year rate national average is about 6.5%. So for the fiscal model for this scenario test, we decided to use 6.5% long term. And so if we change it to 6.5%, the tax rate goes up to $39.57. So it's an increase of $428 for that house annually to Howard County, because they're paying a high, if the loan interest rate is higher, then the monthly cost, the mortgage is higher, so your income has to be higher. It could be argued that as interest rates go up, home prices go down, but we're not really going to look at that particular aspect. And it's given the demand of housing in Howard County, I think in general, as interest rates rise, then it's going to cost more for somebody to move into a house. I think the pressure on housing prices are such they're not going to really drop significantly. So if you compare that to the original mortgage rate scenario of 5%, the 18-year average annual net revenues, the original assumptions was 52.5 million, and now it increases to 55.4 million. So it's a 5.5% increase in the net results overall of the whole fiscal impact analysis over the 18-year period for all of the growth, reflecting all of the increased income tax from this scenario from all the housing units purchased, countywide. So the next scenario, we looked at capitalization rates. So capitalization rates are used to determine the assessed value of rental apartment units. This is what the state assessment office uses in most cases to determine the assessed value for apartments. And so we had used 5.23%, and I'll show you where that comes from. It comes from this thing down here, and the next slide gets in a little bit more detail. It comes from the CBRE capital rate report for multifamily capitalization rates in the Northeast regions. We sort of target it to the Northeast region. It has been recently 5.23%. A comment was made last time that rates are going up, just like as the Fed increases the base rates, then interest rates are increasing, including the capitalization rate. So if capitalization rates increase, then the way that works is that the valuation decreases. So they work in inverse. And so this comes from the same method, the same source I had shown before from CBRE, which is Coldwell Banker, I believe. That's sort of a standard company that produces or tracks these things. So in the Northeast region, 2021, the 4 quarters, I had used the sort of an average, took those 4 divided by 4 to come up with 5.23. That's historically, this is the latest we received from this research group, and you can see that capitalization rates indeed are increasing. So you can see that go up. And the latest, as of June 2022, that we have is 5.6%. So it looks like they're under an upward trend, as indicated last time we met. And so for purposes of the scenario test, we've decided to use a 6.5%, which seems reasonable to be, potentially a long-term average going forward. We don't know what the future is going to hold, but for the scenario test, we just decided to use that. It seems to make sense. It's reasonable. And so then what is the impact? Well, if you increase the 6.5%, the valuation goes down to $308,000 per apartment unit. And so the overall fiscal impact results are reduced by 11.2%. So relatively big impact. And one of the reasons for that is, if you recall, the future projections for residential land use in Howard County in the draft Hotel by Design is mostly rentals. About 48% of all future units, given the location and land use and the activity center concept, we're going to be building most of the future units in higher density mixed use activity centers, downtown Columbia and the other activity centers that were discussed earlier. That's a fair amount of units, so it has a relatively big impact if you increase the capitalization rate. So it drops by 11.2%. The third scenario test was we changed the affordability ratio. So it had been 28%. And so if that increases, then the local income tax drops to $2,900. So if I go back here, it had been $3,500 in the original, and now it drops to $2,900 because the higher affordability income ratio results in a gross income change. So the HUD standards for affordability indicate a range between 28 and 36% of household income. And that includes principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. And so that's what this part here calculates. So we increased it to 32% from 28%. It was a good suggestion for this increase. And so what is the impact of that? If you look at the overall impact, I'll just go straight to there. It's a drop of 8%. And so and again, this is countywide. We see that impact. Want to keep in mind, we learned this last time from the presentation from EDA. They had this chart here, and it's interesting to note that Howard County residents actually spend less of their income on housing than the national average. For example, this is a home ownership costs. 15.9% of Howard County residents spend 35% or more compared to 21% average. So generally, there's some categories where Howard County is higher, but generally, Howard County generally pays less. And same with rental costs. So I think that's a good argument. We can go up to 32%, but going higher to 36% really probably is not a reasonable thing, given that standard is really a national standard.
Yeah, so Jeff here, I want to add a little bit, just based on what you already said there. So the original assumption of you 28% was still within the national range there, but on the lower end there, by moving this to 32% in the middle of that, it's taking essentially a conservative approach, because based on the EDA, which is the Census Bureau's data, the county typically doing better than the state, have a less percentage of income spent on house there. So your original model, in other words, it was solid, but if we want to be conservative, move to the national average, then we can use 32% there. So that's just a point we want to make, and something subject for discussion later there.
Right.
What do you
Thank
think?
you, Holly. And it's also the other thing to keep in mind, these are people moving into new homes. So typically, if you're moving to a new home, newly built home, generally you're going to, maximize what you move into. So the rate, even though, for example, here, many people in Howard County spend, 35% or more, or actually, for example, less than 20%, 52% spend for less percent. This includes people that have been living in their homes for a long time. So their income increases over time and their mortgage rate stays the same. So that sort of trend makes sense. But for purposes of the fiscal model, this is for new construction. Generally, in most cases, people spend or they get a loan based on the affordability ratio of, within that 28 to 36% range. A bank's not going to loan money to people with anything higher than that, except of course in the Great Recession when they were going as high as 40%, and we know what happened with that. But generally, the conservative standard is between 28 and 36%, and it really varies. It depends on people's credit score, it depends on the bank, et cetera. But again, the value is to look at the magnitude of difference, right? So if we went from 28% to 30%, 32%, it decreased by 8%. If you do go to 36%, it's probably going to decrease by 16%. So just keep that in mind when you look at the fiscal results. It's really a way to look at the reasonableness of the fiscal model. So the next one, the fourth one, is we decided to reduce non-residential assessed valuations by 10%. This came from a comment from several people asking the question is, of what's the future of office space given the remote work possibility moving forward. And so if you do a 10% reduction, we could have done a 20%, but we just chose 10% to look at the magnitude of difference. You end up with this assessed values of 10% less. And that could reflect less job growth, therefore less building space being built. It could also reflect a decrease in assessed value because the demand in general for office space and retail space is less over time, given the telework trend. One thing to keep in mind when we look at the impact of this on the next slide is that, and this has been discussed by EDA and others, if you look at the current average assessed values of existing development in Howard County, so this is the total assessed value of all real property in Howard County, $58.9 billion as of July 2022. The ratio is 81% of that total is residential and 17.8% is non-residential, and there's a little bit for agricultural. So as you reduce the assessed value for non-residential, it will have an impact on the fiscal analysis, but relative to the residential impact, it's going to be much less because the overall assessed value for non-residential is, under 20% countywide. So the reduction of that is a negative 2.3%. So it's a decrease of 2.3% from the original model. If you assume that. That's for all residential construction, all types of residential construction, office, commercial, retail, industrial, built over the 18-year period. So this is a summary chart. If you add all those up, we combined everything now. Before, what I showed you before was all the independent changes. And now if you combine them all together, you end up with the original assumptions, 18-year average annual, 52.5 million. The above four combined, which, quite frankly, is a conservative approach. It drops to 43.5 million, about a 17% decrease. But again, you look at the magnitude of that and the reasonableness of that to get an understanding of what those impacts may be. So they're still positive net revenues, they're just less than what they had been before. So next, we're going to add the inflation factor to all of these changes as well to look at the nominal results. And that's what this shows. So on the left is the chart I just showed, change of negative 17.1%. The chart on the right is with the average annual increase of 2.5% inflation, 18 years. And so the chart we showed at the beginning showed a change from the original assumptions with inflation from 52.4 to 71.1 million. And with all of these assumptions we just talked about and the changes, it increases to 58.9 million on a nominal value, nominal basis. And this is the result, including the average annual and the year one with the changes and inflation included. In year 18, it goes to almost $100 million moving forward. So that's the four scenarios we looked at. And at the very end, as Holly mentioned, we're going to have a discussion about what people think of this and what we should and should not include in the base model. And the goal is to produce a revised base model that we could move forward with. So a few additional questions. This was a question that was raised. It's a good question. It relates to, we have these land use projections in HOCO by design. Now, on December 6th, I believe, I talked about the land use in Howard County, the latest land use. We update it every September 30th of each year to provide projections to the school system and other county agencies. Also related that land use to the HOCO by design projections and the policies within HOCO by design. So the question was, we know that there's less than 5% of land in Howard County that's undeveloped. So where are all these jobs and housing units going to go? And so this is a little bit more detail of that. So our land use model projects at the parcel level every piece of land in Howard County. And it includes existing land, it includes future capacity based on several categories. And what the main point of this is to point out that about half, 43%, the first three items there, of the future of the county residential units are either, this is as of September 30th, 2022, under constructions. We have 1,600 housing units under construction. They're recorded unbuilt lots. So basically it's a plan that was a subdivision that was recently recorded, doesn't yet have a building permit, but will have a building permit. So there's about 1,900 of those. This also includes apartment units and approved SDPs, site development plans. And then the DPZ has our land development division is reviewing plans that have about 5,071 units in them. And so that's 25% of all the units. So we have a lot of units in the pipeline. The rest is undeveloped capacity. That includes redevelopment potential. So that includes downtown Columbia, the future of downtown Columbia. If you look at Columbia, most of this is downtown Columbia. What's left. It also includes all the rest of Columbia. So besides downtown, there's some additional capacity, but most of it's in downtown Columbia. It includes redevelopment potential along the Route 1 corridor. So it's an estimate of what the county has capacity for based on current zoning. And regarding how that relates to HOCO by design, so on the left is a map, that's our existing land use. The size of the dots represent where the future development is going to go based on what we know, based on what's in the pipeline, based on the zoning. The map on the right is the FLUME, the future land use map in HOCO by design in the draft plan. Now, in order for the FLUME to be realized, the general plan discusses policies for redevelopment and creating these activity centers. So through the comprehensive zoning process and other policy changes, more capacity will be realized. So the HOCO by design fiscal impact model, based on the APFO chart in HOCO by design, generates 25,000 units. Our capacity is 20,255. So we need to come up with an additional 5,000 units. The FLUME, if you model the FLUME, which we've done, which I'll talk about in the next slide, we have more than enough capacity for those 5,000 units. So it depends on what happens with the comprehensive zoning, in particular the Gateway plan, the Gateway Master Plan, which is also going to be coming forth once the HOCO by design is approved. The reason we stuck to the 25,000 is because it's sort of the market pace, and it also aligns with Howard County's growth control mechanism, APFO, that we've had in place for the last few decades. So there is more capacity than that. but we projected the 25,000 units based on HOCO by design and based on the fact that it takes time to get these policies and goals implemented. And so if you're interested in further detail about the actual capacity generated from the flume, we have on the HOCO by Design website a documentation called Community Viz Methodology for Scenario Planning. We've done some scenario planning, and there's a GIS plugin called Community Viz that looks at modeling future changes in the various activity centers. So I'm not going to go into detail on that now, but that is available if you want to take a look at that. There's a lot of information on the HOCO by Design website. We've been doing this for two plus years now. And so there's all sorts of information, good information about the analysis behind a lot of these numbers that you're seeing. Okay, another question that came up was about the school maintenance. This is important because we wanted to accommodate this, and so we included in the fiscal model, and this is in the assumptions document, this concept of, besides just the cost of new construction per seat, which is here. So basically, as every new student is added to the county from moving into a new home built into the future, through the yield rates for new construction, that's the county's going to need to incur a cost of $54,000 for high school, $51,000 for middle school, and $37,000 or $38,000 for elementary school. So that's occurred in the fiscal model. In addition to that, as part of the capital budget, there's these costs here. They're systemic renovations. So typical renovations of a school building over time. It's not the complete replacement of a school building, but it's the ongoing renovations, and it's about $33.3 million in the FY23 approved capital budget. So we took that amount, divided it by the number of school students in the 21-22 school year, and came up with this cost of $580.90. So we actually incur that cost for each new student in the county moving forward for these typical maintenance costs moving forward. A few other questions and clarifications. The question came up about enterprise funds, such as water and sewer funds. Why don't we include those? Generally, enterprise funds, or not generally, but enterprise funds are not included in the analysis. They're really designed to have fees so that the costs are paid for. So the front footage fees and the water usage fees and the sewer usage fees are used to pay for water and sewer maintenance and operations moving forward. So we didn't include enterprise funds. Similar with a fund like the Park and Rec's program fund. People pay for particular services in Parks and Rec, the different programs they have. And so that's used to basically fund that program. So we really looked at the general fund and the fire fund, which are the biggest funds for the county-wide, and also the funds that the county has discretion with in terms of how to spend money. Another question came up: planned service area, any consideration to enhance the expand planned service area in order to achieve the assumed growth development. And there was actually a lot of discussion around that with the Planning Advisory Committee. And so we did consider this. And again, going back to the hocobydesign.com/scenario planning, you'll see a lot of information on that. There's a scenario planning guide where we looked at that. And there's also, we wrote a separate educational piece on the wholesale expansion scenario. Let's say we did expand the planned service area line further to the west. How would that work? Would it be a good idea? Those kinds of things. So if you're interested in that, you can go into that. Ultimately, the decision was not to expand the planned service area line. Primarily, and this is, again, after discussions with the Planning Advisory Committee and all of the strategic advisory committees, public comments, and an administrative decision. Generally, it would be a major reversal of 50 years of policy to preserve the rural West. In many respects, much of the goals have been met for land use preservation in the rural West through agricultural preservation easements and environmental preservation easements, through the state's purchase program, through the county's purchase program, and also through the rural zoning, the density exchange option where land is preserved. You can see in these maps that a large amount of land is preserved in the rural west, upwards of 40% or more. And so the goals have been met from the policies instituted the last 50 years, particularly since the 1990s when the county's IPA program was created and started. And so from a policy standpoint, it wasn't a good idea. And also from a practical standpoint, it's very difficult. Much of the land along the border anyways is already preserved. So you really can't expand it. If you were to expand it, then you'd have to run water and sewer pipes underneath the preserved land to get to areas that were undeveloped. And the other thing is much of the sort of the yellow area there in the west, it's already developed with large lot, single family detached homes. So from a practical standpoint, it could be said that it's, that option is really not possible anymore. Now you could do it piecemeal, but if you want more detail, you can go into these documents, but the county did spend some time looking at that. Okay, so those are the questions, and I think Holly, you want to talk about this sort of discussion or lead the discussion on how to move forward?
Sure, thank you, Jeff. And thank you very much for going over all those in details there and different sensitivity tests, and also the very good questions from the committee on that. As Jeff already mentioned earlier, there are 4 major scenario testing was conducted, and results are here. So I want to open for discussion, and 2 of them, like the mortgage rates as well as the cap rate there, the original model was reflecting the information at that point, like several months ago probably, and these new scenario, if we go with that, reflect more updated information, and to some extent also still matching long-term trend there. So these are reasonable tests to make on that. The other 2, the affordability ratio and non-residential values there, I would say the original model was reasonable, but these are represent more conservative approach. For example, affordability part, the housing cost as a percentage ratio, we can adjust to national average. Even in reality, we usually do better than average as a conservative approach, which is also will be a nice move, which means the original one was solid, but we can choose to do a more conservative approach, which doesn't hurt as well. That's reflected here. And also in terms of the remote working impact, it's really difficult to quantify, but I guess it's also, if we want to factor in a factor to reflect that potential impact there, that can be included, which is also going to generate a more conservative approach there. So I want to open for discussion from the group at this point. Maybe just anybody can jump in on any of the item to see, whether the new assumption is reasonable or whether we should include in a base model. And I know in the group there we have experts that really know better than us on daily basis regarding the mortgage rate or the affordability or cap rate and other things there. So feel free to jump in. We have a little bit free discussion and decide whether we take all or some of those new sensitivity results there and build into our final model. So it's open for discussion. Anybody you want to speak, just unmute yourself. Thank you.
Holly, this is Steve.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
So when we talk about the affordability index, the one question I have at the 32%, which is the national average, which makes sense, is since over 50% of the new product will be multifamily, are we skewing the 32% enough to make sure we take into account that 52%? So should it be 33.5%? I'm just curious if we've done any deeper dive on that piece there.
Right. So yeah, that's a good point. So I didn't go over this time, but we also used 30%, 32% for multifamily on the original model, and we didn't change it this time. So you're saying that maybe we went from ownership from 28 to 32%. You're saying for multifamily, maybe increase it from 32% to something?
I'm just curious. Look,
Yeah.
and you tell me, Jeff. You have the numbers. My head says it might be a little higher, but maybe the national average for multifamily is 32 as well, and that's really the number we should stick to. I just want to make sure. I know we're trying to sensitize all this. We're backing into kind of what the taxable income will be based on that number, and I wouldn't want to overstate it. And I don't know if that 2% would have a significant impact on the long term. Anyway, I'm just asking the question if we know kind of what the national average is for for renters for affordability, especially
Right.
in this market, which is less affordable than others.
Right. So the range of 28 to 36%, which is the HUD range, I believe it's intended to be for both renters and it's really an advisory range, right? It's an affordability ratio that HUD uses to determine what is affordable. They actually produce these affordability reports, and they look at how affordable residential real estate is, and they have these issued reports that are done every year or so. And so the range of 28 to 36% is really applies to rental and ownership. The charts that we had showed before is that in Howard County, so the mid-range is 32%. That's why we decided to keep it the same for renters as well. If you look at the charts that we showed before that were produced by EDA last week, in Howard County, we're actually different from the national average. Our affordability is better. The percentage of people that spend, there's more renters in Howard County that spend less than the national average on income. Now that doesn't mean there's not an affordability problem in Howard County, because there are a big chunk of residential renters that pay a greater percentage than that range. It's just a question of average, So if we stick to the averages, that was our approach. I mean, you could always run a scenario and increase it.
Jeff, that's good. I appreciate that piece. My only other comment, and others might have more piece on that. You tell me. I would say a long-term average on mortgage rates, is probably 6.5. So even though we've experienced really low rates, we may experience slightly higher rates over the next few years. Go over a 30 or 40-year period. Long-term averages, 6.5. I don't know, maybe 6.25, something like that. So we probably are right using that number for that piece. But I'll let others kind of comment on that.
Thank you, Steve. I don't know, Todd, are you available? Because I know you're the one who talk about the cap rate there. Do you want to comment on the cap rate?
I was just going to say, I think all three of the first three are appropriate with respect to establishing our baseline scenario. I just don't know about the fourth. It's the only one that's kind of arbitrary. So I don't know if it's the right number or not. But I had a similar question to Steve. As the composition of our new residents changes as a result of the delivery of different types of housing, will that necessarily change that affordability ratio? But my gut tells me that, and all it is a gut, is that 32 is probably an appropriate number for that. And as it relates to cap rates, I definitely think that's a good move with respect to valuations. It's hard to imagine a lower rate environment than we had the last 10 years, and we're obviously experiencing major changes in that now. So I think moving it to 6.5 makes a lot of sense. So I would definitely be in favor of that as well.
Thank you, Todd. Any other comments and thoughts from the group?
Is there anything that we didn't look at? Holly and I went through all the questions and the responses and tried to capture everything.
Yeah, I guess this is Richard, and I didn't want to comment because I missed the meeting where we could develop the scenarios. But I mean, this is kind of a stocks versus flows issue, and again, new development does pay for itself. But isn't the issue that the cost of services in Howard County is escalating more than inflation? And the cost of services being held constant and a fixed or escalated at a constant rate relative to in the same rate as income doesn't catch that imbalance. So the issue is Howard County government is getting more expensive, per capita each year than inflation, and that's not baked into the model, and that variance will be exacerbated by the change in composition of development by going from less single-family homes, which have huge, much larger escalations in revenue than cost, as we get more multifamily and condo. So isn't that an issue? And is there a way to bake that in? And I'm sorry to throw it out because I did miss that meeting.
So Dr. Clinch, I think you missed the first part when we talk about nominal value and also methodology of fiscal impact analysis there, because there's a couple of things. One is that we have a balanced budget. We have to have a balanced budget for the base budget. I mean, just not talk about the new development at all, just talk about base budget. So number one, the 2.5%, it really matched historical level pretty well. If you don't count on any new revenue or new costs from new development, just say the same people stay there for same houses for, that's very close to historical experience on that there, and even slightly higher than historical average if you just take out the new development related cost of revenue in the last like 10 years on that. So that's like a good trend. I would say that even slightly higher than historical average if we use 2.5%. The second thing is, as I just mentioned, that it's a balanced budget. So in reality, we have to force revenue expenditure the same. So what happens is that just say, okay, for example, fringe benefit, the health benefit, let's just say it's increased, say 5%, but the revenue only increased 2 or 3%. So even we have any new development, what's going to happen is we have to cut back something else or slow down something else so that it still match on the revenue side. So this model there, it has to be balanced. I don't think we could say the costs grow faster, revenue slower, because in reality we have to match them anyway for the base model there, right? So to calculate all the future years there. And in reality, if the revenue is higher, then the cost will grow faster as well. So there are like in parallel in that way. So I really don't feel like we should talk about the base model itself there, whether it's 2.5 or higher, because it's again, also you have higher revenue and higher expenditure, or lower revenue and lower expenditure. That when you have talk about net impact, the change will be very marginal on that. That's my understanding there.
Okay.
And I guess I would also ask, that was a sort of a statement, Richard, that the per capita cost in Howard County is increasing over time. Do you know, like, where does that come from?
The budget's grown faster than inflation, and I'm estimating. To tell you the truth, I have not run it. I could run it. But I think just when you have the increases we had in revenues and both revenues and expenses per capita have grown faster than inflation because of the nature of the growth in Howard County. And what I just fear, and it isn't, and I don't know of a way to capture it in this model, is the inflection point when more multifamily, which is going to have lower revenue growth per capita than single family, hits the budget. And I don't know of a way to capture that in a model.
Right.
I think it's already captured, because what's happened is, I think, Dr. Clinch, you were talking about the new development impact. The new development impact there, as Jeff's models is showing, is that really based on the future years, how many multifamily versus how many are single family. So in each model is actually a large portion is that disproportionately higher goes from multifamily, and which has associated lower income, and actually, you know, cost side may not be that much different from the single family. So for the new development part, that's already captured because all the development here for the future is mirroring. That's what local by design projected housing portfolio. If we talk about the base, remember last 10 years, the county's revenue and expenditure growth, that's not only reflect a base change, it also include the new development in those years. There you have to take that out to know where is the real base growth of same people, same house growth on that. So if you recall a little bit higher than that, it's because those other new development in this period contributed to that as well on that. So if you just talk about base itself without new development, I think 2.5% is very reasonable, sort of a guess, educated guess to talk about a base. And then for the new development, which we're focusing on there, it's already the feature of the future portfolio with associated revenue expenditure, it's already captured in the model. I don't know whether this makes sense to you.
Well, I think Todd here. I think Richard's point is a really good one, and I don't know if we have the data or not to tell us. Hang on. I don't know if we have the data or not to tell us what our spending is per capita by housing sector. Are we spending more per capita for single family detached residents, or are we spending more per capita looking at multifamily rental? If we don't have that information, then we don't really know how the changing composition will change our spending. My expectation is that, particularly when it comes to schools, that spending per pupil will go up as the housing composition changes because the needs will change of those students. But I don't know that there's any way to quantify it unless we have some sort of data available to us now to help us evaluate what our spending is by housing category per capita now.
Yeah, and it would be interesting to look at the question. I mean, to Richard's point, yes, costs and revenues are increasing faster than inflation, but the reason that is because we've been having new growth, right? But I still ask the question, on a per capita basis, are costs and revenues increasing faster than inflation? It could be because the only way that would happen is if levels of service are increasing. Now, historically, for example, that has happened where we went to all-day kindergarten. So you had to have more teachers. It had been half-day kindergarten. So as levels of service increase, yes, the spending will increase over time. But historically, it'd be interesting to look at that question on a per capita basis. What are the expenditures over time? The other question, yeah.
I'll run it and bet you a cup of coffee that it's gone up much.
Okay, that'd be really interesting. It's a good question. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the spending per capita in the school system is readily available. So that's not hard to determine. And I'm not taking your bet, Richard.
The thing is, the base there, because we have the 2.5% inflation for the nominal, it's basically already assumed per capita per student cost is going by 2.5% for the base calculation, holding everything else the same, and like the rest of the county's service is the same. So that's the general thought on that. So I guess I still try to figure out how do you. And by the way, I mean, if you look at the history, you have to take out the new development impact there, assuming no new development and all the population growth generate from new development. You have to take that out to see that, right? And then,
but it would be just doing it per capita. But here's my fear: we, as a county, it's a truism. It's a mathematical certainty that this model will yield a positive result, having helped create one of these models in the past. So the answer is new development does pay itself. And also these types of models will tend to underestimate the long-term benefits of growth because especially for single family housing, it's also a truism that incomes grow more rapidly and housing costs stay relatively fixed because you have a fixed rate mortgage. So these also tend to undercount for single family homes the long-term benefits of development. But we've had a growth in Howard County because we had a huge bubble of single family passing through. That bubble is built out largely, and we're switching to a different model of development. And that bubble helped cover the costs that escalated for everybody more rapidly. And also, you're going to have higher churn demographically. The more condo and multifamily you have, people buy the average tenure of a single family house is longer, so you're capturing more of those income increases. Whereas any multifamily, especially the churn, the average residency is much lower. So unlike single family housing, demographically, the county got a person who stayed in a house for 30 years, but you're replacing them with people who stay in apartments for 5 years. I'm making every one of those numbers up. And that has income growth standpoint. So again, I don't know how to capture the change in composition through a model, but I'm worried that this doesn't count it in the way that I'm fearing for the fears that I'm saying, which may or may not be wrong.
Well, and I think that it works on both sides of the equation, and that's where I guess I have some of your same fears, Richard, is that we've largely held non-school services per capita in our budgets fixed, and they haven't grown as fast as the schools. So the question is, will they necessarily have to grow to catch up, because we've been basically deferring a lot of costs, non-school services that we're delivering. So it's not only that the composition may demand higher spending per capita, that the housing composition may demand higher spending per capita, but that we also have catch up that has to be made irrespective of the housing composition.
Yeah, that is a good point. Jeff, do you mind bring back to the slide 9 and talk about the methodology? If you go back on that, it might help a little bit, because I think a lot of this is our arguing regarding the base itself used for projection, whether the base needs to change. So I want to just, I guess, emphasize a couple points I made earlier. The slide 9. We'll just talk about a couple factors there. Slide 9. Yes. So there's a couple of things. One is, as Todd just mentioned, that it's a balanced budget. So there are factors that could say the actual revenue, even per capita revenue, higher, or the per capita expenditure higher as well. But because we have to develop balanced budget, it will be a wash. And even within the same budget, if the base is same FY23, you could argue in the future years the share of different departments, they might be shifting between each other, right? And that could happen every single year. And some department get faster or agency get faster growth than others with the same bottom line. So those shift across, that could also happen there. The issue is that if you just talk about expenditure, those internal shift there, it will change, but it's not going to change dramatically the results of the model, because the model have a per capita cost for everything. So some things per capita cost become higher. The other things per capita cost has to be lower in order to offset that. So it's not going to go one-on-one, but it's going to, at the end of the day, it's going to large wash within expenditure side. If the argument is that different agency, different type of expense have different pace with the same bottom line. If it's talk about the revenue and expenditure itself there, they may not stick to the 2.5%, which could be, some years are higher, some years are lower, even not count on the new development. The revenue expenditure also have to balance itself there. So if the expenditure is higher than 2.5 and the elected officials agree to do that, what's happened is if the revenue doesn't go there, then you have to change tax rate on that. So as a result, then the base will be higher on both revenue expenditure side there. And as a result, the new development exercise we're talking about is going to reflect a higher revenue and a higher expenditure per unit, right? So that will be, again, it's not the complete wash, but then can change to the conclusion in terms of magnitude and also the long-term trend. And you can swing any way. And on the revenue side, for example, if a good year, the housing appreciation is higher, property tax might be better. If a recession, it could be lower. Then in result, then both revenue expenditure will be lower than the 2.5% as well, right? So that kind of exercise is it will be interesting to do, but there's so many unknowns there, and also at the end of the day, I don't think you swing one or another is going to at least change the net impact too much from the new development. So that's what I was thinking. I mean, we're still open. I mean, if Dr. Clinch or other, if you have ways to quantify that, we can run something on that. It just I'm not too sure it's going to change much about the tentative conclusion here in terms of net impact and also the multi-year trend there.
Yeah, I agree. New development pays for itself, and this model finds it. And the scenarios change, positively or negatively, how much new development contributes to the overall fiscal health of the county. So we're talking about something that's just you're minimizing, or you're getting more or less of a contribution to the bottom line. My fear is that we're getting less and less new development because as the county builds out, and Jeff's population's projections show us, the contribution of new development is going to be lower relative to historical trends where you've had lots and lots of new people coming in that have contributed to the bottom line. That's I'm not criticizing the model, which I think is great, and the scenarios, which I think are good. It's my fear of what it means to the overall fiscal health of the county that new development is going to give less and less push to or emphasis or benefit to the bottom line than it has in the past.
Right, and actually, if also on the HOCO by Design website, we did a fiscal analysis of all the various scenarios. So you can see exactly what you said, Richard. The more growth, greater revenues. The composition of growth also changes things. And so the goal is to look at what is the impact of the draft HOCO by Design, including the pace of growth that's envisioned and the type of growth that is realistically going to happen given the changing land use composition of the county. All those things you said are true. And then this is the result that we're showing. So the question is, given this, we'll have to be cognizant, the county will have to be cognizant of the fact that the large increase in revenues that we could have been used to because of a lot of single family detached growth isn't happening as much. And that's clear in the scenario planning effort, which is also on the website.
I actually have a question, and maybe is it possible to maybe accelerate cost, at a higher rate than say the revenue? So you've got basically, you're assuming that revenues and costs go up with the same amount, but clearly it seems that we could experience a higher cost rate than our revenue growth, and it'd be interesting to see basically where we break even. So what's how much wiggle room do we have? Because obviously these numbers look really great because they're both kind of growing at the same rate in terms of nominal growth. And so just kind of thinking about, let's take the more conservative approach and think about our cost growth going at a faster rate than our revenue growth, which has happened. So I might be interesting to look at it. It might be a little bit easier to look at than trying to break down the composition of cost by housing type, but to make an assumption regarding, one scenario might be to look at cost growth faster than revenue growth.
Jeff, that might be complicated for your model, I'm sure, because you probably just have one cell that's giving you your inflation growth rate that's applied to both sides equally. I think I would be nervous putting, you know, a 2.5% inflation factor on this when we know we're going in with projected revenues being higher than projected projected revenues are higher than projected expenses. So you get this artificial spread or growth of benefit just by the inflation rate. And I think that goes to Darius's point, is that we don't really know that, and we don't want to give up just an arbitrary benefit to the spread between revenues and expenses by assuming an inflation rate of 2.5, because we don't know that the inflation rate will be equal on both sides of the equation.
Right, and that's sort of why we stick with real rates of return in these analyses, because things inflate at different ways, the housing market versus other things. So I think showing that initially is good. Showing the nominal is also good in terms of trying to look at real, you know, more realistic pictures, particularly in relation to answering the blueprint question. But we can certainly, you know, if we were to present this, it's already been presented as is. If we were to present this at the planning board, we can certainly show, you know, just the real rates results, the chart on the left, for purposes of, you know, the argument and simplicity.
But to Richard's point, this should be pretty straightforward, it seems to me. If we calculate spending per capita over the last 10 years, let's say, is it greater than or less than the inflation rate over the last 10 years?
Oops. Yeah, that I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, that's so Richard said he was going to do that, right?
Yeah, I think
I'm looking for the county's budget numbers per.
yeah, if you can do that, I think that would be helpful. If do that per capita cost, but also per capita revenue at the same time.
Do you have a spreadsheet of revenues and expenses just aggregate by year? I'm looking for it online right while we talk.
If you want to look at the yeah, I can find that information. We can find that information, the actual revenue and actual expenditure, and in the last 10 years, and then divided by population to show that there. But I think the actual revenue always usually exceeds the revenue expenditure rather than be higher, because, you know, we try to manage to make sure everything stay within budget. So I don't think you'll see more cost increase than revenue. I mean, we can.
No, you wouldn't, because you couldn't. But the question is it growing more rapidly than inflation?
Inflation, yeah. Let's do that. I'll get you the information, Richard.
Yeah, I'm looking online. If I find it,
if you can do that there and divide by population to see. Yeah, I think it will be good to have. Yeah.
I'll put it in my presentation. I'll send it around.
Thank you.
If you can send me the revenues and expenses figure, that would be great. I'm not finding it online real quick.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And we'll all buy the Starbucks gift cards. Have them ready for you.
Right.
Okay, so good discussion. So we'll work with Dr. Clinch and look at the per capita cost change there, and also per capita revenue change there in the past several years, and also I'll look at the inflation factor, right? And then so see how does that mean there. And sounds like for the rest of them, if you go back, Jeff, go back one slide there. For the rest of them, it seems like these are all reasonable factors to building. The top three, I think, is definitely yes, we can include it in the revised model. The non-residential part, it's a more arbitrary one for the remote work. So it's may or may not need to be, but if we want to be conservative and account for that factor, I mean, it's okay. I mean, we can include it in the base model just in case that has some impact on that. So in other words, I don't have a problem with factoring, even we really don't know what that's going to be materialized there. But I mean, I guess take conservative approach to undershoot revenue is not a bad thing to have, just to make sure things work out there. So at this point, I'm guessing that for these 4 factors, they're probably we can all build into the new assumptions into the the base model, which is going to bring down the net impact, which will still be very positive. Every year is you have measured in real dollars, $43 million net gains to the county. And if you look, nominal value is 2.5, is like an average of 59 million net gains per year in the next 18 years there. At the same time, so if we have no objection, we could have Jeff build into it. At the same time, we'll work with Dr. Clinch on those other per capita costs to see whether anything we need to bring back to the committee, and then see whether any alternatives will be needed there. Does that work for everyone?
Yes, for me. One other thing, as you're collecting data, we've been saying for years, and we're warning, I guess, more accurately about the growth in the public school spending. And while you're collecting data, can we, as you're looking back, are our warnings accurate in the sense that is the spending for the public school system a higher percentage of total spending on a per capita basis now than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Is that actually happening, or are we warning about something that, looking backwards, hasn't really happened?
We can calculate that as well. That's a good question. Yeah. We have the data, so we can calculate that as well.
That may more accurately fall into our report as opposed to our analysis of HOCO by design, but it is something that's relevant that I've that I've wondered about.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, thank you. That's another good point. I think we can look into that as well. Yeah. So if no further discussion on this, let's go to the next one. Is just talk about the future meetings there. It's next week we have quite some speakers there, including someone from the committee, actually multiple people from the committee there. We'll talk about the CIP overview there. At this point, I collected from different agencies, both outside and internal agencies, about CIP requests for not only FY24 and also next 6 years there. And the numbers are still changing. And as you all know, between now and executive deliver these proposed budget to the council on April 1st, these are going to continue to change there. But just to give everybody flavor, I will share what I have at this point, the overall big picture on CIP, and also we invited the different entities there to talk about some of the key CIP projects. So our partner from Community College and Library will share their requests on CIP, and our school system there is scheduled to talk about that together with operating budget on January 31st, and a couple of county agencies will talk about a few big projects or known needs from the county side there, or at least provide an update there. And Dr. Irani will share the economic outlook for the region and nationally, which is always very good to know as we kind of look into what we need to build in next year's projection. And the following week will be Dr. Clinch talk about economic outlook, and that's a very much more reflect the county situation in terms of especially personal income, which is going to be one of the drivers for our revenue forecast there. And at that point, hopefully we already allow Jeff to modify his model to reflect the final changes assumptions there, as well as we get the chance to be able to draft the report. And remember, this year we'll have a special charge for a very brief report, but important one related to the HOCO by design fiscal impact analysis. So we'll bring here for the committee to review, and we'll try to send it in advance as well, so that we can comment on that and try to finalize by end of January, which is due to the county executive by that time. And the following week is also going to be important because that's the last lecturing session that our school system, possibly led by superintendent, we'll talk about superintendent proposed the CIP and operating budget on that. And then also we'll discuss the revenue and multi-year projection from budget office, and our finance department will talk about credit rating and also debt projection, debt indicators on that there. So by end of January, we'll have been both wrapped up the HOCO by design fiscal impact analysis review from the committee, as well as the general discussion regarding next year's budget preliminary projections. And then in the month of February, a lot of the focus will be talk about recommendations, what are the things we need to include in the report, and craft the report itself on that. So that's the general plan on that. Any questions or comments from the committee before we wrap up for today? And by the way, if we have more information on the actual exercise about per capita calculation there, we'll make sure to share with you and maybe bring back next week, just very briefly talk about that if it's ready at that point. All right, if no further discussion, thanks everybody very much. Clearly, we see very valuable input from everyone, and it continues to help us fine tune and make it better and more reasonable in terms of assumptions and overall model. And these are also very good questions, very good input. So really appreciate everyone. And Jeff, do you have anything to add? And thank you all also so much for working with us.
No, I have nothing to add. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
I appreciate everybody's attention to this, and as Holly said, it really is. It's been valuable to get your feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the whole group there. Well, thank you. I'll see you next week then.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.